attention is with you.
Thank you, Angela. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you joining from all over the world. It is really a pleasure to be here today and present to you our latest Women Business and the Law report. It was launched just 2 weeks ago, so it's really hot off the press, and I hope that you will find this data and this research useful in your work, and I look forward to hearing also from Julia about the plans that Germany has, and also from all of you in the audience to hear your experience and what you have seen in your work. Let me just start by saying that this has been a very hard year, but it has been especially hard for women. Laws that encourage equal economic inclusion can make societies more resilient. But unfortunately, all over the world, women are starting at a disadvantage. Discriminatory laws are holding women back from reaching their full potential, and this threatens not only their economic security, but also that of their communities and their societies. I'm just going to start sharing my presentation. I know we tested it before, so I hope that it works. All right. At the World Bank, we believe that no country can achieve its true potential without the equal involvement of men and women. That's why at Women Business and the Law, we set out to identify where exactly laws are preventing women from working and running successful businesses. Over the last 11 years, Women Business and the Law has presented a unique data set that measures progress toward gender equality in the world of work in 190 countries. We examine how the law treats women when it comes to freedom of movement, to those that prohibit discrimination and sexual harassment in the workplace, to those that affect women's pay and their rights when they get married and have children. We also measure women's constraints to starting and running businesses, the different treatment of women when it comes to managing and inheriting property, and all the way to laws affecting the size of women's pensions. Our data identifies where discriminatory laws persist in these 8 areas affecting women's stages of their professional life and highlight opportunities for reform. Our research builds evidence on the critical link between gender equality and economic growth. We know more today about the importance of equality of opportunity than we used to. It is important because women are human beings and these are human rights issues, but also because there are economic benefits to equality. Our recent analysis shows where laws treat women more equally, we see a lower gap in development outcomes. We also see more women working, and where they're working in better jobs and earning higher wages. We also observe that where laws give men and women more equal opportunities, more women are represented in national parliaments. Now, it could be that women legislators pass more equal laws, or that more equal laws empower women to become parliamentarians. More research is needed to build the evidence of this relationship. Yet, although we know about the benefits of gender equality, and these issues are not new, there's still much more work to be done to fully reap its benefits. Women Business and the Law 2021, our latest report, shows that globally, the average woman has just 3/4 of the legal rights of the average man. If we average out our indicators across all 190 economies, the global average score is just 76.1 out of a possible 100. But this number hides great variation both across regions, but also within regions. If we look at regions like Sub-Saharan Africa or Middle East and North Africa, we see that there are more than 60 points variation between the lowest scoring country and the highest scoring country. But we must continue to push for gender equality everywhere, in every region and in every country. The biggest takeaway from this is that every region has room to improve, and every region has economies that have good practice laws already. This means that governments looking to reform don't need to look far. They can look to their neighbors, or they can inspire their neighbors to reform. And this year, we have 10 countries where men and women are in equal legal standing across all the areas measured. Ireland introduced a reform on parental leave, and Portugal equalized the remarriage process for men and women, joining 8 other countries, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Latvia, Luxembourg, and Sweden, that score 100. But that means that in 180 countries, there are still remaining gaps between men and women. And these gaps are more pronounced in certain areas, and in particular in the areas of pay and parenthood. Women deserve equal pay and choice of jobs. but in 88 countries, women cannot do the same jobs as men. These are jobs in transport, manufacturing, engineering, construction, water, energy, and mining, and these are often jobs that pay more. These restrictions impact nearly 2 billion women across the world. And even where women can do the same jobs, they are paid less. In 100 countries, it is legally acceptable to pay women less for equally valued jobs. And when it comes to laws affecting parenthood, there's much work to be done. In 38 countries, women can be fired just because they're pregnant. And although more and more countries have paid leave for fathers in addition to mothers, the average length of paternity leave is only 1 week. Childcare needs to be a shared responsibility between parents if we are to have gender equality at work. Yet only 40 countries have parental leave. But we have some good news as well. Despite the pandemic, 27 countries across all regions reformed their laws to increase gender equality. And we see many reforms precisely in those areas that I mentioned that need them the most, in pay and parenthood, but also in areas of marriage and mobility. And we also see regions that need it the most, reforming the most. 25% of the Middle East and North Africa region reformed in the last year. But we also see countries that score well already continuing to reform. The second highest region with reforms are the high-income OECD economies. Just wanted to share a couple of examples of reforms that we recorded this year. This is one that was done in Marshall Islands, where they introduced laws that mandate equal remuneration for work of equal value. And the same reform was done in also New Zealand and United Arab Emirates this year. We also saw many reforms in the marriage indicator. Chile introduced gender-neutral language, allowing both spouses to remarry as soon as a divorce is finalized. Other important reforms in this indicator in particular are related to introduction of domestic violence legislation. Kuwait and Madagascar introduced comprehensive laws on domestic violence for the very first time. But if we look over the last 50 years, and my team has done a fantastic job recalculating our index all the way back to 1970, we see that the path of change is going in the right direction. All regions have improved. Almost every single country has introduced some reforms over these 50 years, but the improvement has come at different speeds. OECD, high-income region, Latin America, and Africa have made the biggest improvements over the 50-year period. But the progress has been slow and uneven. If we look at the annual increases of each region, we could see OECD countries seeing gender equality in the law as soon as 2025. But it would take another 60 years in regions like the Middle East and North Africa, which are the furthest behind. If last year has taught us anything, it's that we cannot wait that long. The need for reform is even more urgent today because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we have devoted an entire chapter in our report to this issue. The gender pay gap has also widened during this period, and women are more likely than men to take leave or resign from work to care for family members or because of restricted mobility. With 740 million women globally in informal employment, and a majority employed in services, women are particularly hard hit by the crisis. Women often face lost opportunities and reduced financial independence when schools are closed, and they have increased unpaid family care responsibilities. They also have heightened risk to disease exposure due to their role as caregivers and health workers. In the United States, more than 2 million women have left the workforce, and Vice President Harris has declared this a national emergency. But this is happening all over the world, and it is an international crisis. And this crisis is also very regressive. And unfortunately, women make up a large share of the world's poor. So there's a real concern that we will see setbacks in the gains made over the last few decades when it comes to gender equality. So what can be done to address this issue? During our research this year, we found that some governments have put in place measures that address the impacts of the pandemic on working women, especially in the areas of childcare, remote access to court systems, and protecting women from violence. But these efforts have not been enough. Even before the pandemic, working women cited increased childcare and family obligations at home as the primary reason for leaving the workforce. During the COVID-19 pandemic, women's childcare and family obligations at home have only increased and become more pressing. Accordingly, keeping women in the workforce has only become more important. Policy responses that serve to alleviate childcare will keep women in the workforce. Secondly, we looked at access to courts. Women initiate the majority of family law cases, including in matters formalizing marriage or divorce, seeking custody of children, and requesting protection from violence. This is why access to family courts is an important component of women's security, voice, and agency. Dealing with family law matters during the pandemic is certain to bring about unexpected and unprecedented issues. Custody arrangements, financial obligations like alimony and court closures amid stay-at-home orders are disproportionately affecting women. In such cases, justice systems may consider implementing innovative methods to serve women and men while maintaining safety as a priority. And the pandemic has also shown the impact on safety at home. A staggering number of domestic violence cases are being recorded. Now that work and family life have become intertwined, it is more important than ever that laws governing women's rights in the home advocate for gender equality. During our research this year, we found that some governments have put in place measures to address the impact of the pandemic on women, and we focused on these three areas: childcare, remote access to court systems, and services for survivors of violence. The unequal distribution of care between men and women within households and lack of childcare support for working parents is nothing new. But COVID-19 has just exposed more than ever that there is a childcare crisis around the world, which is escalating gender inequality. Since the start of the pandemic, most economies temporarily or indefinitely closed schools. And we found that nearly 40 countries around the world have introduced leave or benefit policies to help parents with childcare. Most of these economies, however, are high income. And childcare leave policies, we noted, vary widely in eligibility, requirements, duration, and pay. Eligibility is almost always tied to formal employment, because often benefits are paid from Social Security insurance programs. The duration of COVID-era childcare leave and benefit policies can also fluctuate. In economies like Argentina, the duration of childcare leave was based on the duration of state emergency or school closures. Some economies also introduced wage compensation for lost income due to childcare obligations. But what about parents who are not eligible for the benefits or simply cannot afford to take leave without pay? To address these challenges, some economies introduced innovative childcare assistance measures, for example, babysitting vouchers or tax credits. But we also found that it's important to support the childcare industry itself through specific funds and tax relief, which some governments have done. And we also found some governments introducing special measures to provide childcare for essential workers. This was done in New Zealand and Singapore. But overall, we found that COVID-era childcare measures, though key in the short term, are insufficient to tackle the motherhood penalty and solve the childcare crisis. Long-term strategies to build robust childcare infrastructure, encourage fathers to equally share in unpaid work, and reconcile the demands of both childcare and the workplace are critical to achieve gender equality both at home and at work. Now, as I mentioned, court closures and stay-at-home orders impact women because they are usually the ones initiating proceedings seeking a divorce, child custody arrangements, or financial obligations such as alimony and child support. To guarantee access to family courts on the one hand, it is important to address these issues even during a state of emergency and declare them as urgent or essential. This is most widely approved measure that we have observed, remote access to courts. According to our data, 88 economies allow for remote court proceedings. This includes electronic filings of claims and virtual hearings. Some economies were already equipped to do so. Others introduced new laws to respond to the crisis. The appropriate responses unfortunately depend on availability of resources. We see that in less developed regions, remote procedures are not widely adopted as in others. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, only 16% of economies were able to conduct remote proceedings compared to almost all economies in OECD high-income countries or Europe and Central Asia. If the internet infrastructure is not there, countries like Guinea-Bissau found innovative methods and introduced notification and filing by phone. So when it comes to access to justice for women, new technologies and mobile services, along with necessary resources, are key. These measures need to be introduced in more countries and not remain temporary. Policymakers also need to address gaps in digital literacy and access to information technology for marginalized groups. And of course, a really important finding is that domestic violence cases are on the rise. Recent report from World Health Organization shows that worldwide, about 1 in 3 women and girls experience physical and sexual violence in their lifetime. And this was true even before the pandemic. We know that experiencing violence has an impact not only on women themselves and their families, but also on their communities, societies, and countries, including the economy. According to our latest data, only 32 countries still lack legal protection from domestic violence. But that's still too many. The global increase in domestic violence during COVID-19 has been called the shadow pandemic. And evidence of an increase in child marriages is also emerging from several countries. This has led to an increasing call to helplines and reports to the police, and shelter operations are at low or no capacity. Violence against women is one of the major barriers to women's participation in the economy, not to mention its economic cost to societies, even more so during and after this pandemic. And so we found governments responding to this by introducing new measures. The most common service introduced or expanded were the use of hotlines. In China, for example, the 8-hour domestic violence hotline is now a 24-hour operation. Another common service we found that has been increased during the pandemic is related to assisting with psychological needs. In Ukraine, for example, 6 mobile teams provided psychosocial assistance through Skype, Viber, phone, and online support groups. Shelters were another service provided by some countries, although not in large numbers. In France, as shelters exceeded capacity, alternative accommodations were found in hotels for domestic violence survivors. Other services include legal aid, additional police resources, and assistance with housing and healthcare. Diverse responses to domestic violence are fundamental, but more essential are measures to prevent this violence in the first place. Governments still have room to enact measures and policies aimed at addressing the root causes of this inequality and violence. A legal environment that encourages and incentivizes women's work can make them more resilient, not only in the face of crisis, but throughout their lives and careers. And we need to think beyond short-term or emergency measures. This crisis is really showing us how important childcare services are for achieving gender equality. They were already lacking before the crisis, and these needs have been only amplified. But also access to justice and ability to enforce legal rights are essential. In addition to our index and new data and research on the gendered effects of COVID-19, this year's report also contains important background research on childcare and access to justice. These are areas that we would like to expand to in the future. Now, I know I gave you a lot of information, and you can learn more about our data and research on our newly revamped website, wbl.worldbank.org. I encourage you to download and read our report, use the data in your own research, your own advocacy, and your own policy making. I look forward to hearing your feedback on any of the areas I discussed. Legal and regulatory reforms can serve as an important catalyst to improve the lives of women and their families and communities. In the pandemic that continues to threaten the progress we have made, reforms ensuring equality of opportunity are more important than ever. And the law is only a foundational first step, but it shouldn't stop there. I just gave you a global picture of what the world looks like when it comes to laws affecting women, but it will take a determined effort from governments, firms, and citizens to make change really happen. Thank you. Back to you, Angela.
Yes. Sorry, I just had to unmute your mic. Thanks so much, dear. Very insightful, very well prepared data, and I think a solid base for policymaking, programming, and knowing where to start. There were some questions in the chat, and I would, before I comment on it any further, I would first allow our participants to have their questions attended to. And Natalie, I would ask you to read them out.
Yes, we only have 2 questions in the chat so far. One is from Thomas Meyer. Is there any data showing correlations between social welfare systems and equality, in particular of women? In many countries, in particular post-socialist ones, personal and family networks are becoming the only working protection against unemployment and such things.
Thea, you like to respond to it?
Yes, we haven't done
Complex
this.
question.
No, it's a very good point, and we certainly would like to look into it. We don't have any analysis about it in this report or anything that I can share in this at this moment. But I do think that's something that we have heard about not only in post-socialist countries but also in Africa, East Asia, where family structures are different. There might be a family network that you can depend on, and maybe childcare then is not the most essential issue during this particular time. But we still believe that there are benefits to childcare systems beyond just who takes care of the child. There are benefits also to the children's development. And so we hope that we can have more information on this in the future.
Thanks so much. Maybe turn to the next question.
Well,
like
the
to make,
second,
so, yeah.
yeah,
Go
the
ahead.
second question is actually more of a comment, but maybe we can transform it into a question. Rebecca Kuhl noticed that in one of the first slides on worldwide legal rights of women, Saudi Arabia seems to do better than many other countries in the MENA region. And she thinks that this is intuitively surprising. Maybe you have some additional information in regards to that.
So Saudi Arabia in particular has been conducting a lot of legal reforms. So they, when we first published our index, this index only started about 2 to 3 years ago using data that had been collected for many years. Saudi Arabia had the lowest score. And they really took this very seriously and started looking at what areas of the law needed to be changed. And over the last 2 years, they have introduced many reforms and have actually gone from having the lowest score to having one of the highest in the Middle East and North Africa region. But this is only related to the 35 questions that we ask in our index. So, we know that there are issues beyond the law, and there are many other things that affect women's economic empowerment beyond the things that we measure. But in the areas that we measure, they have noted a significant improvement.
I have a question myself. Do you do any correlation with statutory laws or customary laws, like those covered by the OECD SIGI index? Because sometimes, especially when it comes to family issues, family concerns, including childcare and marriage, they're governed by statutory laws.
Mm-hmm. So we only include codified laws. So in some cases, if customs or religious practices are codified in the law, then we measure them. We have done some research with SIGI data as well, and our data is highly correlated. So often when there's legal protections that are lacking in the law, they're not necessarily covered by other types of customary practices. But this affects only a subset of countries. And so that's why, to be comparable across 190, we measure only codified laws. But of course, in some countries, having customary religious practices really have a bigger effect than the codified law. And I think for that, it's important to do deep dives into these specific areas and in these specific regions and countries.
Thank you. We don't have any more questions in the chat right now, as I see. Am I right, Natalie?
Yes, and the moment this is all, I think.
Okay.
But maybe we can also have another Q&A.
We will definitely. You
I
all
just
given
wanted
a little bit more. Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. I know there were some discussions about the regions, but we unfortunately have to use the World Bank regional distribution, which is sometimes not really fitting with how others look at it. And so we have this OECD high income countries, which are OECD and high income. And so it's a bit of a hybrid because most of the World Bank regions are focused on our client countries, which are developing countries. And so the Europe and Central Asia includes mostly Eastern Europe and Central Asian countries that are not part of the EU. So just to clarify that sort of regional analysis. But all of our data is available online, and you can regroup them however fits your need best.
Right. Okay.
Actually, there was just another question by Roxana Frey, whether access to education and healthcare, including access to sexual and reproductive health rights, are included in the study.
Not at this point, and not in the index itself. The index covers 8 areas that are structured around different parts of a woman's life, but starting with her, structured around a woman's working life, I would say, and starting when she enters the workforce. And so we are exploring ways to include education, access to education, as well as protection against sexual harassment in education, and sort of think of what happens before women are at that point of starting their careers, and look at access to education, but also issues of child marriage. As I mentioned, they're very important and often prevent women from accessing education. So at this point, we don't measure those issues, but maybe in the future we can.
We've just received one more question, and then I would like to hand over after that to Julia Lehmann. Natalie, you like to read out the question?
Sure. It's another question from Thomas Meyer. Is the data accessed directly to the data via API or only included in the report?
No, our data is also on the website, and we have country level data, including the names of the laws that we've looked at. And so that's all available on wbl.worldbank.org. Maybe one of my team members, if they're attending, can put a link to all the different data. We also include data for the 50 years, so not just for this latest year, but over the 50 years. And we have some new data visualization tools on the screen that on the website that can allow you to compare different countries or by region or by decades and look at different areas. And we also include information on the reforms that we've uncovered over this 50 years. So you can look up a country and see all the different laws that they've changed over the last 50 years. That's also available on our website. If you need any further information, just let me know. We'd be happy to provide it. I just want to say that it's really an honor to produce this report and this data, but we really treasure when it's used. And so seeing it used in the other reports or in other projects is really when we see the benefit. And of course, if we can see it actually influencing change on the ground, that is the ultimate objective of this work. So if we can help you in any way, and in the way that you need to use the data by providing different tools or packaging the data in different ways, please do let us know.
Thanks so much, dear. I think that was perfect for handing over to Julia. And Julia Lehmann from the BMZ. Mrs. Lehmann, the floor is yours to respond to the data, but as well enlighten us on what the plans are for the future.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Thea, for this excellent and insightful presentation. And rest assured, we'll definitely be using your data. We've always been using it ever since the first edition of Women, Business and the Law. And like many other reports from the World Bank Group, they're always very, very sound material to use and to argue politically where we're heading, and to discuss where we should be heading. And we're particularly grateful for the spotlight you've provided on the effects of the COVID pandemic. We're still in the middle of it. We still don't know what the effects will be at the end of it, but we can already see the preliminary effects. And you've highlighted the childcare crisis, which we've also in the work we're doing are seeing as one of the very essential assets, if you want to, that countries can provide to make women's economic life easier. And in your last remark, you've highlighted we're talking about women, business and the law. It's about the framework conditions to enable women's economic empowerment. And so childcare is key to it. A lot of us have seen this personally over the last few months, suddenly struggling with children being at home. And in Germany, our children are back only this week to school. They've been home since December. So, a lot of us will relate to this personally. And in addition, we've also seen that women are very resilient in crisis, but they need a framework. They need a social, a political, and a legal framework from outside to foster their resilience and to protect their resilience. So childcare is definitely key, and you've pointed out rightly, it's also about, of course, quality childcare, but it's also about the accessibility. And here also social norms matter, not only the legal question, but social norms. And I think this is true to so many of the aspects we will be discussing in women business and the law. I think you've put it very very prominently in one of your chapters, where you said you can change the law, but you need the social acceptance of those changes. And I think it's very interesting to see where sometimes laws overtake social trends and then they are not accepted. And, you need more profound and fundamental social change to bring about change. But sometimes even laws can only sort of, sort of recover from, or not recover, but can sort of catch up with social trends that have already happened. And I think countries are very very diverse in where the social norms lie and where the legal system lies. So I think that's also something we have to bear in mind when we demand legal reform. Will this be socially accepted? And that is also true for childcare. If there's no if there's no willingness to provide childcare also in a public sphere, then it is it is hard for women to engage fully in the workforce. Access to justice, extremely important, not only for women, by the way. We've seen a lack of access in justice across the board, also for men, due to the pandemic. Lucky where sort of online access is possible, but we've even seen this in high income country that often there is no digital access to justice, and therefore that is extremely important. Also, not only in cases of custody, of alimony, but of course also in cases of gender-based violence, where it comes to criminal courts, to criminal prosecution of gender-based violence, which has risen across the globe in every single country, which we have seen. Gender-based violence, violence against women, violence against children, violence against LGBTI communities. We've seen it across the board. So there, the access to justice is also an access to criminal justice, which I think is very important. The third area you've mentioned is women's health and safety. I think health is pretty straightforward when we look at the healthcare systems, and it's also it's those countries have fared better which have good public healthcare services. So I would strongly make the case it's not only about healthcare, it's about the accessibility of healthcare, and where healthcare is public and is publicly provided, we've seen that these countries fare much better across the globe. Safety, of course, is very important, and I would add to this, it's not only personal physical safety, but it's also social security. And I know you've got this one indicator on pensions, but I think this is another lesson learned from the pandemic. We need women more in the informal work, more in the formal work sector, especially in developing countries. A majority of women still work in the informal sector. They have no labor protection and they have no social security. So I think when we look forward, and we've often, not sure this is 100% correct English, but somehow in our ministerial strategies, we've started to talking about recover forward. The idea is not only to sort of simply recover or recover better, but forward and take this crisis as a chance, and start thinking about how we do things better and differently from before. And so bringing women into the formal workforce with labor protection and with social security protection, I think is essential. We know there's so many studies. We know that women, are much more independent also in the social and political sphere, the more they are independent economically. I mean, this is a truism, which is of course vice versa the case as well. So I would add social security to women's health and safety. And when we started talking just before the recording started, we've also mentioned that we liked your focus on including women with disabilities, because that's the other area where we see intersecting forms of discrimination, of being left behind. We see that the effect is is exponential, if you want to. So looking at women with disabilities and also other intersecting forms, looking at women who are discriminated against because of their ethnicity or their sexual orientation. There we see from the first evidence on the pandemic that this has a detrimental effect on their status or their way of faring in this pandemic. So these are my comments on your very excellent report, and very timely report, of course, as we're struggling to formulate our policies and strategies to, as I said, recover better or recover forward or build back better, whatever term you want to coin. It is extremely valid to have those. Now, what Angela asked me to also point out what the German government is doing in that respect. I would say there's the key areas of intervention in the sphere of economic empowerment for women are, first of all, decent work. We've started developing, or it's already we have the first draft of a national legislation on business and human rights, and that prominently includes equal pay for men and women. And it is addressed to German businesses, German enterprises acting abroad, particularly through sub-firms or sub-enterprises and so on and so forth. It's about the human rights accountability of German firms, and equal pay is one key element of that. But it's also about, as I said earlier, bringing women into the formal workforce, which of course has a lot of benefits throughout their lifetime, even after they leave the workforce when they retire. So that's one area. We're also looking at a European regulation on business and human rights, which is something we've already initiated under the German presidency of the EU Council, which ended in December 2020. That is one area. And then, of course, there is what we call access to resources. That's access to financial resources. For example, access to banking products, financial services and financial products. During the German G20 presidency in 2017, together with the US and other donors, we've launched the Women Entrepreneurs Financing Initiative, which is most prominently housed with the World Bank. And there we've already managed to serve 130,000 entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs across the globe, give them access to finance, train them, build their capacity, and trying to remove structural barriers by that as well. And that's part of our wider field of looking at financial inclusion, where we see that there's still much to be done about accessibility. And again, here, intersecting forms of discrimination are particularly pertinent if you look at financial inclusion. But access to resources for us is also access to land. And Thea, if you have more research, more results from your research on access to land, I know there is an indicator on that. We feel that's very important, because in a lot of, particularly in those countries where there's a majority of the GDP produced by agriculture, and countries that have a large rural population, you still, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, you still see a lot of countries where women cannot own land and where women cannot inherit land. So it's about inheritance laws. it's about property laws. So that's particularly important to grant women some sort of economic independence, especially if the male household leaves, or if he or she, if he dies, or if there's no male heir to the land. So that's all questions that relate to women's land titles. And of course, then there are lots of, these are sort of the more narrow economic empowerment focus areas we have. But of course, and I think the last question we had from this first round of questions related very much to it, they're of course sort of, very fundamental framework conditions before women enter the workforce, before women can enjoy their economic potential, which of course has a lot to do also with gender-based violence, sexual and reproductive health and rights. If women have no control over their own family planning, if women are married off early or in a forced way, there's no chance they ever even enter into the workforce, or even have a thought about their economic potential. And also harmful traditional practices such as female genital mutilation, and I've already mentioned early and forced marriage, that impedes women's chances to flourish economically. So we have to look at those as well if we look at it wider. I'm not saying you have to do this all in your report. I know you business and women, but if we look sort of at German policy, that's of course what we have to bear in mind. And first and foremost, education. Germany is launching a new a girls' education initiative in May. We're doing this together with the Malala Fund. So this will be also an immediate answer to the COVID crisis. We know that millions of girls won't return to the classroom after this crisis. And there will be some sort of lost generation of younger girls in education. So we're trying to counter that through a new initiative. So these are the policy areas. Now, how are we trying to do this? And there's one process which I particularly would like to mention, and that's the generation equality process. It was launched by UN Women France in Mexico, and the beauty of it is it's a multi-stakeholder process. So it's not only countries, it's private sector, it's civil society, it's philanthropic foundations, it's international organizations. And we all join forces in 6 different action coalitions. One is on economic justice and rights, which I think is very important to this particular field we're discussing today. Germany took one of the co-leads in this action coalition. And I always say, and some of you might have heard of this before, I think the beauty of the process is that it's not an intergovernmental process. We're not negotiating ourselves down to the lowest common denominator, but it's really an action-oriented process. We're all contributing concrete actions to making this better, and finally and ultimately reaching SDG 5 eventually. I'm not sure we're getting there till 2030, when we have to make much progress much faster than we've done so before. So this particular action coalition that focuses on economic justice and rights can truly benefit from the research you've done. And whoever is listening today, we're happy with with new members, and there will be the first Generation Equality Forum in Mexico, and we'll be calling for members to join this action coalition. It's intended to make real progress over the next 5 years in those areas I've described. And I've also seen among our participants, I've seen Wengen Go from UN Women, who's our UN Women focal point for this action coalition. And I'm sure we can join forces if there are questions on that to answer them. So I think joining forces there is good, and I know that there is also an initiative from the multilateral development banks to get closer to this process. So making this, an endeavor that is shared by all, by not only the UN and some countries and private sector and civil society, but also by the development banks, I think is crucial. One very last point. I think that also goes a little bit beyond the question of what exactly do we want to see in women business and the law, but to stress that we really need transformational change. And there, I think the legal aspect and the question of do social norms comply with the new laws, or are social norms lagging behind, or social norms maybe even more progressive than the law? I think there it is very important, and the key message here is take men and boys on board. We need them for structural change. We need them for social change and changing the way women are looked at, but in all spheres of life, but particularly also in the economic life. So that's what we should be aiming at, and we shouldn't be satisfied with less than transformational change to really make progress on SDG 5. So I'll leave it at that for the moment, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
We can't hear you, Angela. Angela, it's not working.
Now I should be, you can hear
Yes.
me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, gorgeous. Thanks so much for your response, Julia, and the outlook to how you are going to use the data and what to use it for. And I think, yes, definitely, for attending to economic justice and rights, knowing the rights, the legal frameworks, conditions on the ground is essential, because otherwise, and I just looked at some data prior to our session today, where it was in a different context. This was about gender and intersectionality, but I just looked at the differences sometimes made between married and unmarried women. And for example, just looking at sub-Saharan Africa, there's still 6 countries where in married couples, women have not the same right to control or make decisions about the family income. So here we have a situation where even if the woman, the married woman in this case, is empowered and earns a higher income, if it flows into a family, joint family income, it definitely benefits the family, but whether or not she is able to take decisions on it is not secured. So therefore, digging deep, and that's what you do with your report, is so essential, and it will help us to tailor make or adjust our responses to it and know where to start. Having said that, we do have questions in the chat, and we have the first one, Julia Constanze Braunmiller, who is breaking the ice. She raised her hand, so I would first of all give the chance to you to ask your question or respond, and then we turn to the questions in the chat, and whoever else wants to ask a question, please raise your hand. Ms. Braunmiller, the floor is yours. You can unmute.
You. Yes, thank you so much.
If you just introduce yourself so we know who's talking, please.
Gladly. So my name is Julia. I am from Germany too, so I'm super happy to hear about the policies that you're doing to promote women's economic empowerment. And I'm working on the Women Business and Law report, and I've been working there for many years. So this is a great collaboration. And I wanted to respond and also ask questions on 2 issues that Julia raised. So one is the Access to Finance initiative and WIFI you were talking about. And at Women, Business and the Law, we look at that through kind of the lens of access to property rights for women. And one of our findings that also Thea mentioned in her presentation is that only that 40% of economies around the world still restrict women's property rights. And that starts with unequal access to inheritance, to limitations on women's property rights during marriage. And as you certainly know, it's incredibly difficult to reform these laws because they're often rooted in social norms. So the other angle we're looking at it is through preventing discrimination in access to finance on women, if there's laws that prohibit discrimination. And that's where we still see a lot of reform. But as you mentioned, the WIFI initiative, Entrepreneurship for Women, is so important. And I would love to hear your input in maybe other areas that are in the regulatory and legal framework that could promote women's entrepreneurship. And that's part one. And part two, I was happy to hear you mentioned the issue of intersectionality and women with disabilities. And I just wanted to mention that we have recently done a pilot project on the rights of women with disabilities, looking also at the legal framework, how non-discrimination legislation protects the needs and rights of women with disabilities. And we're trying to take this work forward by kind of expanding our research in that area. So I'd also love to hear your input on areas in the regulatory framework that could promote the rights of women with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would first of all, I think, turn to Thea to answer and then hand over to Julia if you would like to add something.
Thank you, Angela. So Julia is on my team, and I asked her to respond to these issues because she is really the expert, and especially when it comes to issues of family law and entrepreneurship and access to assets. And so I had asked her to give some more information on what we currently count on that. But I have so many good responses to what Julia Lehmann had talked about, and I think we're very much aligned in the priorities that you have in focusing on these areas that you mentioned, including childcare, access to finance, education, and I look forward to future discussion. But I think Julia's questions were directed to Julia or others in the audience. As we look at what else can we measure, we are looking at, are there other issues around financial inclusion that are regulatory in nature that we could be including that we currently don't have, and what are other ways that we can expand our research on women with disabilities. And we're already looking at, right now we only looked at constitutions or particular laws dealing with disabilities or women with disabilities, but we're looking to expand into employment laws or looking at protections in the workplace, or in particular related to sexual harassment or violence against women with disabilities in particular. So that's just a few comments on that. But those are sort of new areas of research.
Good that you dive into it. Thanks so much, Thea. Over to you, Julia.
Yes, so, well, thank you very much, the other Julia, for asking those questions. I guess you're much more the expert than I am. What other are the regulatory obstacles to, for example, access to finance? I mean, of course, sometimes it's very basic. Sometimes it's women can't open bank accounts, you know. Sometimes it's more subtle. It's about that they need their husband's permission to open a bank account, which I believe was actually still the case in Germany up to the 1970s. And so, you know, there are various obstacles depending on the country context. And of course you can, and of course this is our privilege as a government. You know, we do have intergovernmental negotiations with our partner countries. And in those negotiations, you of course can raise the policy issues. But often you find yourself that in practical sort of, you know, cooperation, you sometimes have to work your way around it. I know that from some country contexts that we're supporting women cooperatives in the agriculture sector. We're supporting women to form women-only cooperatives, women-led, women-owned agricultural cooperatives. And often there, women aren't allowed to open a bank account, but legal personalities are. So once they form a cooperative, they're suddenly allowed to. So, you know, there are sometimes practical ways of working around it, but of course it depends on the country context. Your question on the rights of women with disabilities. Again, here we often find that there is no formal legal discrimination of women with disabilities. It is often a question of accessibility. For example, if you provide healthcare services, for example, now with vaccinations, but you have to go to a place where you are being vaccinated. And if you are seriously physically injured, disabled, for example, if you're in a wheelchair or if you have trouble walking, you know, it might be in a developing country very hard to actually access those vaccination centers. It's a very simple example, but it shows that often the factual discrimination is what matters less than the formal legal discrimination. Same with, you know, access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. The legal law might not discriminate in between, you know, heterosexual and homosexual persons, but it often does factually, because it doesn't provide concrete services and it doesn't provide answers to those who are seeking questions about, for example, homosexual sexuality and so on. So I would say, you know, it is often a question of the of factual discrimination less than formal legal discrimination when we look at women with disabilities. But of course, you know, there's still, especially in the educational sector, you know, there often, you know, it is that you know, girls with disabilities are still barred from going to school. But of course, there again, it's about social norms. You know, it's about you know, whether disabilities are accepted, whether, you know, families feel obliged to hide their disabled children, or whether they, you know, can openly you know, live their lives with their children with disabilities. Of course, it does depend on social norms as well. I'll stop here to allow more questions. Thank you.
Actually, there was an earlier question in the chat by Annalene Voss with the International Rescue Committee. It's addressed to Ms. Lehmann. How will Germany ensure refugee and crisis-affected women are not left out of the commitments for the Action Coalition on Economic Justice and Rights, given they often face additional legal barriers?
Angela, shall we collect a few questions before I answer to make sure we've got enough time for all the questions?
There are not so many in the chat. There's one more here. Natalie, you want to read it out?
Yeah, the other one was about SDG 5A2. What about it in terms of measurement? Maybe for those listeners who are not so familiar with the SDGs, it's the proportion of countries where the legal framework, including customary law, guarantees women's equal rights to land ownership and or control. And as far as I see, that's it for the moment from the chat.
I would encourage all participants, please raise your question. This is a chance you have. Thea Trombeck and Julia Lehmann with us, ready to answer and respond. But now I hand over back to you to respond to the two questions we have just heard. Well,
yes, thank you very much. Yes, we do see that women in migration, whether that's forced or voluntary migration, well, we would rather talk about displacement, you know, and particularly women in forced displacement situations do, you know, encounter multiple forms of, you know, challenges to their human rights, challenges to their economic situation. That is definitely clear. The first question is, in legal terms, you know, are they internally displaced persons, or are they, you know, are they in a different country, and what is their status? So the legal status, unfortunately, often you know, is key to the question, what can they do economically? We've seen that in many countries, also in high-income countries, that asylum seekers are not allowed to work, for example, and they're not allowed to engage economically. So there are severe restrictions. I'm not going, you know, that very much depends on the national context, what they're allowed to do. We do actually, you know, that they are within our view. That is clear. We've last year we've founded a new action network for women in forced displacement, and the beauty of that network is that there are a lot of women themselves who are in forced displacement are engaged, and they have their own projects which we help fund through a UN fund, and They bring in their own personal expertise. They bring in their own perspective. Local perspectives do matter a lot, because those circumstances of migration and forced displacement, of course, vary a lot. And of course, here again, for women in a status of more or less voluntary migration, I always find it very difficult to find the right work, because if women feel forced to leave their country and work abroad, for example, as a housemaid or as a nanny or whatever, is that really voluntary migration? I always ask myself, the question is where is voluntarity and where is force, where's the line? But if we look at that from a legal perspective, where we have sort of voluntary migration of, for example, especially women in the service industry, there we often saw also in the pandemic that suddenly they've lost their income, because a lot of them again are working in the informal sector. So again, here it's about creating formal work for these women, through, for example, tax incentives, whatever, make sort of the black market less attractive by providing tax incentives for the employers, by providing easier social protection and social security through healthcare insurance and so on and so forth for this armada of women across the globe who serve in multiple forms of service industry, as I said, housemaids, nannies, whatsoever. So here again, it's about bringing them into the formal sector would already help a lot, because also then they have a legal status. Apparently there were, I haven't got any numbers yet, but apparently there were millions of women stranded in countries which they weren't allowed to leave due to the pandemic, but they've lost their jobs and their income, because they were household servants, and they were simply fired at the beginning of the pandemic, and but they weren't allowed to leave the country. So a lot of them sort of roaming around countries without any income and without a legal status. So that's also one aspect of when we're talking about women in formal migration. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We have one more question in the chat, and then I actually do have two of my own. But first of all, let's turn to the question in the chat, and that comes, Natalie, you take over.
Sure, there's a new question addressed to the World Bank. How do you coordinate your data assessments with the many studies on the performance regarding SDG 5 undertaken by UN Women? And how does it correlate, as you have a different database regarding the countries looked into?
The question is from Ursula Schäfer-Preuss.
Thank you for this question. It's a very, very good one. As we do our report, we always keep track of all the other research that is mentioning similar areas and try to see how we correlate with those measures. And usually it's we've done several correlations even just to come up with the questions. We look at first whether there's evidence in literature that these are areas that matter, and if they're correlated with outcomes that we want to see influenced, such as women's female labor force participation, or the gender wage gap, or different.
Whoops.
Good collaboration. Oh, can you hear me?
No, yep, it's fine again.
Yeah. So with UN Women in particular, we actually collaborate on SDG 5.1.1, which is a sub-indicator that looks at legal frameworks. And we work together with UN Women and with the OECD SIGI team, and both teams contribute to this, and this data is validated by the countries themselves. So we send the data we've collected to the individual countries around the world, and then they confirm or validate the information. And that indicator was created a couple of years ago, and we're just reporting now for nearly, I think the latest reporting we had 94 countries that have validated the information. So we do work very closely together, and many of the UN Women reports, actually, if they do mention legal frameworks, they refer to our data themselves. And so we're often cited or included in their data sets as well.
Thanks so much, Thea. I have one more question here, and that's a question: how does the World Bank itself use the data again? For example, in the Doing Business report, because it's normally in different constituency and audience reading the Doing Business report than the Women Business and the Law reports. So how do you use it internally to influence?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it's been a long history with us in Doing Business. In fact, Women Business and the Law started in the Doing Business team, and the executive board of the World Bank came to the Doing Business team, which was gaining prominence, and said, what about female entrepreneurs? Is the business regulatory environment different for women rather than men? And so the original questions were included in the questionnaires that Doing Business conducts. But we found that a lot of the issues come, as Julia had pointed out as well, before you're actually at the point of becoming a firm. It comes to, needing to open a bank account or just needing permission to leave the house or travel freely. And so we sort of evolved with generous funding from a few donors to create our own data set and measure these issues differently. Now, Doing Business does have still a few questions on issues pertaining particularly to women, and we do collaborate a lot in referring to each other's data. But the World Bank uses Women Business and the Law in many ways beyond the Doing Business team. So it's used in assessments of the gender assessments that the bank does in different countries and different regions to look at the legal requirements and the differences between men and women in certain areas. And it's also used in some of the corporate commitments on meeting, showing progress on equality, so that one of the indicators in the corporate scorecard is the number of reforms that countries have undertaken in women, business, and the law areas, and it's a measure to show the impact of some of the other work that the World Bank does. Mm-hmm. In fact, if you're interested in this question in particular, there's a box in this year's report that shows some sense of how the bank is using it, but also what other institutions and other organizations and under indices that exist out there are using it. And if you find more, please let us know. We're always trying to track the impact of the data and how it's used by others.
Thanks so much, dear. There's another question here directed to you, Julia. And Natalie, are you going to read it out?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure. Which role do you see for gender justice in the Lieferkettengesetz, and in how far do you push for its inclusion?
The question is from Daniel May.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. The Lieferkettengesetz is what I referred to earlier. So for the non-German speakers, that's the law on business and human rights, which I was referring to. I think it is publicly known that this endeavor in Germany isn't one of the easiest legislation we're going to pass. There has been sort of different views from different ministries. I think that is that has been public in the press, so I'm not revealing any government secrets here. Together with the Ministry for Labour Affairs and us from the development side, we've pushed very hard for this piece of legislation, even against against the interest or the perceived interest, I must always say, the perceived interest of some of the lobby groups from German business. Some business have clearly stated they favor a law because then it's a level playing field. Then you can't build your own benefit on sort of violating human rights. So there are quite a few businesses who are in favor of this law, but there has been quite a bit of opposition from the private sector. However, this, why I'm saying is to understand this piece of legislation is a highly a very highly contested and very very hard won piece of legislation. So from a gender perspective, yes, I think at one point or the other it could still be sort of more gender responsive. however, you really have to see how much progress we're making if, we really get to pass this piece of legislation that, we are already quite content with a clear reference to equal pay and the formal sector. So this is what's in the legislation so far. So we think this is really already a very big advancement. And my division is not only responsible for gender, but for human rights in general. And I think not even for the women of the world, but for a lot of men in this world, in developing countries, if a lot of countries pass those legislation, I think a lot of things will be much better. So yes, it could be even more gender responsive in an ideal world, but this is how politics work. I think if we get it through, it's a very, very big success. It's a very big step, and maybe we can even in implementing it, make sure we use gender disaggregate data. I think this will be very important to use gender disaggregate data to measure sort of the progress on what business are doing in this field of human rights. So I think even in implementing this law, there's still scope for making this more gender responsive. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the answer. And I do have another question, as I said, and that relates to the new EU Gender Action Plan and its rollout. I mean, the EU is putting a lot of, they've themselves called it a very ambitious agenda, and looking at the rollout and that they want to have country level implementation plans in place by the end of July is a tall order, because they should be built on negotiations with partners in the countries, state and non-state actors, the private sector, as well as member states and implementing partners. So how do you see the connection to, the relevance and the role Germany will and can play, and then looking at BMZ and GIZ for that matter, since we are together here, but then as well, what the connection to the Generation Equality Forum and Action Coalition, because it's all happening at the same time. So I know you're overwhelmed with all the reforms and ambitious action plans going on, and we all want to be part of it. So
yes, no, thank you. That's sort of the third dimension beside the sort of what is Germany doing bilateral and what we're doing in generation equality. Of course, there's the European level to it. For those who are not 100% familiar with it, a new European Gender Action Plan was launched in November. It is very ambitious. First and foremost, it's an action plan, of course, for the EU. It's binding for the EU institutions, but of course it's guiding for the member states. I think that's important to understand. How do we implement it? I mean, Angela, yourself, we're meeting tomorrow to discuss this. What is the beauty of it? I think there's much more scope at country level to do things jointly. We still, of course, at country level, we have a lot of EU coordination rounds. EU donors meet, and they meet under the auspices of the EU delegations. And we have things like joint programming, where we do things together under the head of the EU. And I think there's much more scope for doing things together. So yes, I do agree. It's very ambitious. I'm not sure we're getting there till July, but it is in the medium term. I think it's the only way we also stay relevant. We shouldn't sort of negotiate each other's out, but we should join forces, as the EU and for what the EU stands. And if we look at the global pushback against women's rights, against human rights in general, if we look at shrinking spaces of civil society, I think there's a lot the EU, with joint forces can offer. That's what we stand for. And that's what we should be standing for in our development cooperation in our partner countries. And if we join forces, I think we can also we can also challenge other models that look less at, human rights and less at gender equality and less at environmental standards. So, it's a necessity to join forces, and there's much more scope. So we should definitely embark on that. Whether we're there by July, I'm not sure, but even if it's September or October, that's fine.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Natalie, are there any more questions in the chat? Otherwise, I would hand over to the two of you. Maybe you have questions to the audience.
Currently, there are no more in the chat.
Okay. So, Thea, Julia, are there questions from you like to ask?
Oh no, there was just posted a very long question or comment rather. Oh no, it's a follow-up, 2 questions. I'm sorry. It's okay.
Okay. So, do you have any questions you like to ask the participants?
Well, I wanted to thank everyone for their participation. I'm glad to see there were so many people attending. And I guess my question to the audience would be, were there some surprises that in the presentation they heard, or if there's something that they find is missing besides the ones that were mentioned? If anyone wants to comment on that.
You feel free to raise your hand so I can unmute you, and then you can engage and ask your questions directly. Might be easier than writing a long comment in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not seeing any reaction here.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. I also wanted to give one more plug for a new tool that we have this year, which is our economy snapshots. They're available on our data page. And so if you have I know many of you work in different countries. If you're having a bilateral meeting with the country, you can download that snapshot. It gives you exactly the scores on each of the sub-indicators and the areas of the law that still have discriminatory practices or are lacking good practice legislation. And we hope that could be useful in some of those bilateral discussions to raise certain issues that might be of importance.
Thank you for that advice. I do have a question still, and that's towards data. You mentioned you are in close collaboration, for example, with the OECD or with UN Women. Since you're working, well, your focus is on gender and data. Of course, a special focus on women business and the law. But from your own experience and perspective, do you see a gap when it comes to gender and data? Because this is always an issue. I mean, it was a big issue when the 2030 agenda was negotiated and the work on the indicators started. I'm sorry. And the work on the indicator started. So what can we measure? So from your perspective, if you could point out saying that's an area where we need new actors, where we need more of, where we need different data sources or data processing processes.
Well, yes, I do think there's still a lot of information or data that we're missing, in particular when it comes to the gender disaggregated data, I think, and definitions of some issues. So, for example, one of the things we were discussing recently in context of the WIFI initiative was, can we even know how much, if there are certain measures that have been taken to help female entrepreneurs during this crisis with some financial assistance, can we even know if it's actually flowing to women? Because some banks do collect data by gender, but they don't often use it or report it. And so I think having more sex disaggregated data, both by financial institutions, but also by governments themselves, starting to track and then use that data. I think there has been a big push to collect information by gender, but then there's not enough training of the users of the data, how to use that properly in their assessments. So I think that's still a field, and for us, we measure sort of the law, but we want to see the output and the outcomes of those laws. And I think we still have not a lot of sources to really tell us systematically across countries. So I think that's an area that there could be some international standards agreed on what governments can do also to collect the issues on the ground of their citizens.
Thanks so much. Julia, you want to add something to that from your perspective?
No, I think that's absolutely hitting the nail of the problem. So, of course, we're also working, as Tia was just saying, within WeFi, we're working now with private banks, and we're trying to initiate a voluntary initiative for banks to collect sex disaggregated or gender disaggregated data. The UK has already quite an interesting national initiative where a lot of national UK banks have joined forces, mainly led by women who've sort of embarked on collecting that data, and that's a very good example of how sort of on a voluntary plane you can involve the private sector. But of course, we as governments are often not very good at sort of collecting data, and also in the sphere of development cooperation. If we look at financial cooperation, often, when they finance large infrastructure projects, and we say we need sort of, a gender disaggregated outcome indicator, they say, oh no, we're only doing households, and by a household you can't tell whether, for example, when it comes to access, to water or, access to other infrastructure, they, say that they're counting households, and you don't know whether it's a female-led household. You don't know if there's any female in the household, and so on and so forth. So, there's still much to be done, and only then can we formulate sort of, really effective policies when we know where sort of, where the baseline is. You only can formulate a good target if you've got a baseline, and a baseline you can only formulate when you've got good data. And I know that GIZ is also working on a big data project, also with with not shying away to work with the big the big IT companies and the all the big players in the field, including Facebook and Google and so on and so forth. So that will be also a very interesting initiative when it involves. And of course there's also Data 2X from the UN initiative, which does very good work, and it's one of the cross-cutting themes across all the generation equality action coalitions.
Right.
I've only talked about the economic justice and rights, but there are other very important action coalitions, and gender disaggregated data is across the board one of the mainstreaming topics where we need to make progress.
Thanks so much. Natalie, are there any more questions in the chat? Natalie, are you with us?
I'm sorry, I was mute. Sorry. Currently, no more questions, just loads of praise and positive comments. Yeah.
Sorry, I do see one question here. Is the list of local consultants who've been involved in the Women, Business and the Law report, is that available?
I think Natalia shared the list.
Yeah, so I will just put a caveat that they are
I've
listed if they agree to be acknowledged. So we treat their information confidentially, and if they want to be acknowledged publicly, then they're listed on our website. But we often have more than what's listed there because some of them do not want their information shared. So
great, thanks so much. We've come to the end. From my side, a big thank you to the two of you. It was a great session, great insights. I hand over to you for your last words. And I would start with you, Tia.
No, thank you, Angela, so much for this initiative and inviting us. And I'm really grateful to Julia as well for her useful commentary on the report. We will digest that very much and think about it as we go forward. And I do want to say that I take also the point that was raised on including men and boys, and in general, most of our questions look at the difference in the law between men and women. So if it comes to the point where men are more discriminated by the law, we certainly would love to report on that. But unfortunately, so far, the discriminatory laws are mostly on women for now. But I look forward to further discussions and taking this agenda forward.
Thanks so much, Tia. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you. Yes, no, Thea, including men and boys is particularly crucial to changing social norms. I do accept that in your research. You still make that distinction. That's perfectly all right. Yes, thank you very much. We've got a wide audience. I'm, a bit saddened by this virtual format that we can't fully engage with the audience, but thanks to all of you who've sat here, we've seen impressive numbers, and that's particularly thanks to this very interesting report from the World Bank. But thanks for letting me comment on that and explain a little bit what we intend to be doing over the next few years. Next week we should all be in New York. It should be CSW, one of the most important, gender events. So, do join us for a lot of sessions at CSW. There will be one on women's economic empowerment next Wednesday. So look at the calendar for the side events, and the registration will be open, I think, from next week on. Besides that little announcement, I think, we should all join forces in making this change happen, wherever you're working, where, whatever your position is, joining forces and all doing our bits, that's that's what we can all promise and, commit to be doing. And I'm very much looking forward to those lines Thea has shown us, the lines of progress. Some were stable over quite a while and then, rose suddenly, and some were more stable rises. But I think the most important is the message is, it still has to go up for quite a way to make gender equality crucial. And we're looking forward with working with all of you, particularly with you, of course, Thea, and you, Angela, but with all of you who are there, who might have been silent during this, but we know a lot of you are our colleagues and cooperation partners in these endeavors. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I've actually tried, and I hope it was successful, to unmute all of you. So if you like to unmute your mics and give a big round of applause to our two presenters and guests, Thea and Julia, from the World Bank and the BMZ. And I hope it works.
They hadn't considered it, so I went back and told them the first few references.
Gorgeous. It was lovely to have you. Very insightful. I'm looking forward to continue the collaboration and the good work.
Yes, thank you again.
Thanks
See
so
you
much.
soon.
See you soon.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.